Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 8th of March 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we'll just say straight off, a little bit of building works going on next door to the studio. So if you do hear any strange sounds, that'll be what it is. And we have no control over that, so bear with us. Well, the weather is pretty variable across the country. The prize for sunshine goes to Pembrokeshire, overcast in London and Glasgow. What else have we got here? We've got Hampshire a whiteout. We're not sure whether that means snow or not, but it's a whiteout in Hampshire. Plymouth started with a bit of snow earlier this morning, but it's now turned to rain and is pretty cold. So, mixed bag, Mike.
Indeed.
A bit like the political situation, but the Tories have come out with their "Be Kind to the Poor and Disadvantaged" policies, I believe.
Right. Well, there's a much broader issue here as well. I mean, it's bad enough that they have decided to remove money from disabled people. They've managed to push this through the Lords, but of course, this if we extend this discussion a little bit, it does involve the House of Lords. The House of Lords have been trying at every opportunity to prevent this policy from being pushed through. The government has forced it through. So this is Employment Support Allowance. It means that the disabled will, from April 2017, receive £30 less a week than they currently do. They're going to be receiving £73.10 a week from April 2017, and that's equal to Job Seekers Allowance. But what's the broader picture here? Well, the broader picture here is, as we've mentioned many times, and it's one of the reasons why there's such a campaign to change the nature of the House of Lords, and that is that the House of Lords is really the only thing which is trying to prevent this kind of out-of-control behaviour by the Commons and by the government in particular. And so the House of Lords blocked this twice. Then the government have used what's called financial privilege to push this through. Now, financial privilege is the special right of the House of Commons to decide public taxes and public spending. So it's the primacy of the House of Commons in spending and taxation. And although the 1911 Parliament Act, which many people, including us, say was really constitutionally unlawful, although that was really the reason for the Parliament Act because of the Lords past shenanigans in this area, the Commons claims that there's prior art for it, really, a resolution of 1671 saying that the Lords should not alter the rate of a tax, and a resolution of 1678 restates the undoubted and sole right of the Commons to deal with all bills of aids and supplies, so that's tax and spend. So that's what what Ian Duncan Smith used to push this through this time, well, the question is just how lawful it is, because at the end of the day, what the Lords they weren't attempting to control government spending. They were simply saying that in this case, where the money was being applied was inappropriate.
It's just incredible, Mike. We mentioned it yesterday. David Cameron magics up 750 million euros, I think it is. It might be pounds, as the British contribution towards an Anglo-French drone system, so we can produce £750 million out of a hat, drop of a hat, but we can't look after disadvantaged people. It seems to me Ian Duncan Smith wants to crush the vulnerable people in this country.
Well, I think in this case the disabled are being used as a battering ram for the Lords, I just want to highlight this article from the UK Constitutional Law Association as well, from Jeff King, Welfare Reform and the Financial Privilege, and he's discussing this exact issue, talking about a committee of the House of Commons, their resolution with regard to the Welfare Reform Bill in 2012. Do have a read at this. It goes into the law of it quite well, and he is arguing, as indeed I am, that this financial privilege is being used with too broad a brush, and it doesn't really apply to this type of situation. So have a look at that article.
Okay, well, this leads us in very nicely to the fact that there's been developments on the paedophile front in Nottingham. The Nottingham Post here reporting this. Nottinghamshire social worker carried out a string of sex attacks in a care home, and here's the gentleman. Now, he's appearing in court at the moment. He hasn't been found guilty. The court case is likely to go on for 4 weeks. Andres Loggins, and this is part of the report. He's said to have carried out 4 rapes and 10 indecent assaults on 2 girls and a boy he was caring for at the Nottingham home. And of course, what are we talking about? We're talking about Beechwood Care Home. And he was there between 1980 and 85. Children were extremely vulnerable and had no one to turn to, the prosecution said as the trial began in Nottingham. Well, of course, Melanie Shaw, totally vindicated. This very brave lady was the lady that blew the whistle on abuse in Beechwood. And although this gentleman has not been convicted, it is remarkable that the police have actually got to the stage of saying, we've got someone here who needs to be brought into court. Melanie, classic vulnerable person, Mike. So Melanie is one of the people that, as a result of the trauma she's undergone, needs protection and support by the state. We've got Ian Duncan Smith cutting benefits for people. But of course, what was Melanie's reward for speaking out? Not praise, protection, assistance, but absolutely crushed into the ground, forced out of her home. And the key thing is, of course, her child taken away from her. And at the moment, we're not too sure what's happening with that child. So is this the start of the lid coming off or not? We'll add a bit more because we discovered that this gentleman was formerly working at the Catholic Children's Society in Nottingham. This is a document we found on the web, and it clearly states that he's been working with this society. We gave them a call this morning to just ask very nicely what due diligence they'd done when this gentleman arrived. Obviously, all of the background about abuse cases in Nottingham was there. And I'm not sure how to describe this, but the response we got from the Children's Society was unbelievably hostile and aggressive. You overheard a part of the conversation, Mike. It was astounding.
Well, I couldn't really avoid it because she was being so aggressive that I could hear what was going on in your ear from the other side of the room.
Right. So the simple question we asked the Children's Society is what due diligence was carried out to ensure that members of staff were safe to be working with children, and what was the result? Unbelievable aggression and hostility down the phone line.
I mean, all you asked for was a policy document, really.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So we'll leave people to consider what that means. We'll move on to GCHQ because they can spy on the world, but apparently not paedophile networks.
Well, indeed. So this is the head of GCHQ, Robert Hannigan. He was speaking at Massachusetts Institute of Technology yesterday, and he was discussing the whole issue of, well, he had mentioned last year the issue of backdoors provided by technology companies, backdoors to their equipment so that GCHQ could continue to tap and snoop on people's encrypted conversations. And he's complaining in this talk at MIT that he hadn't really appreciated the kind of discussion. He said it caused a bigger stir than I expected. And then he goes on to call for a new relationship between technology companies and government agencies. He said, we should be bridging the divide, sharing ideas and building constructive dialogue in a less highly charged atmosphere. He said it was for elected representatives to decide the parameters of what is acceptable. And maybe I'm being overly cynical here, but of course that, to my mind, that is exactly what Apple wants. Apple wants legislation in place which forces them to hand over the keys to the encryption to government, because that means that from a marketing and public relations point of view, they get let off the hook. So he's calling for legislation effectively by saying that it's up to elected representatives to make these decisions.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, he's calling for more cooperation between the security services and the technology companies. So we watch.
With interest.
Yes.
And of course, we've reported several times that if you do an audit trail through the whole of this spying network, of course, who is ultimately responsible? One person, and that at the moment is David Cameron. So David Cameron has the power in his hands alone to unleash what is unprecedented spying by the state. We're not talking about some Eastern European country from former times. We're talking about Britain in 2016, but remarkably, GCHQ, MI5, MI6, Special Branch, simply unable to break apart the paedophile rings that have clearly been operated through a period of time when telephone calls and information would have been very easy to intercept. So we ask the question once again, could it be that the state runs the very paedophile rings in order to blackmail senior officials into following particular political agendas? Well, one thing's for sure, Mike, links between GCHQ and America pretty tight, which probably means an introduction to Mark Anderson.
Yes, so unfortunately Mark couldn't join us live today, so we recorded this earlier. I began by discussing his latest article in American Free Press about Janet Yellen, who of course is the head of the Federal Reserve Bank. Okay, so I'd like to welcome Mark Anderson to the program. Hello, Mark. How's things in Texas?
Quite windy, but rather warm, Mike. Just staying on the news beat. A lot of things going on in Texas as we speak. An important lawsuit I'm covering this week. But before that, we've got some important topics today. So I thought I'd get back on your show and share those.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're going to start off with Janet Yellen, head of the Federal Reserve Bank. What's she been up to in the Congress?
Well, February 10, she gave her semi-annual report on monetary policy to the U.S. Congress. She, of course, Janet Yellen, is the nominal head of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, our central bank, just as the Bank of England is your central bank. And Janet was as decidedly vague as she always is. It's far worse than watching paint dry. It's as confounding as it is dry to listen to her monetary policy report. It's one of the few times twice a year she has to address both the House and Senate banking committees by law. She has to discuss monetary policy. And it's all the Fed will do. That's the entirety of what they'll agree to do legally to inform Congress and the people of their monetary policy. And as it stands, she really doesn't tell Congress hardly anything at all. But what's particularly alarming are the regulatory powers that the Fed has quietly assumed for the last 5 or 6 years. And this is just now really starting to hit home with the American people, and that's what I'm accenting here.
So what are these regulatory powers then?
Well, basically, one of the most obvious ones or important ones to keep in mind, and the head of the Banking Committee on the House, Jeb Hensarling of Texas, here in Texas, and some other key members of that House Banking Committee, it's technically called the Financial Services Committee, they pointed out in some very rigorous questioning to Ms. Yellen, in fact, the most rigorous questioning of the central bank chief I've seen in a long time that I've covered Congress, they pointed out that the regulatory powers you're asking about particularly have to do with Federal Reserve member banks can have their entire board of directors changed by the Federal Reserve itself. So the Federal Reserve can intervene and change a board of directors of any given Fed member bank, any member bank of the Federal Reserve.
Is that not tantamount to the president changing the state legislature without a vote?
It is, if you look at it in terms of a board of directors being those that vote on terms of bank policy, those that set bank policy just as the legislature would set national policy. And what's particularly interesting about this is that a lot of people say audit the Fed and end the Fed, and for understandable reasons. But Congress goes ahead 5 years ago under the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, and under that they give these expansive regulatory powers to the Federal Reserve. And we have all the Federal Reserve critics, including those on the Banking Committee, that want to audit the Fed. But how do you audit a body that itself is auditing the entire banking system? So a lot of people want to regulate a Federal Reserve that is itself the largest regulator in the country. And many members of Congress are saying the Fed is now, thanks to Dodd-Frank, is the largest regulatory body in the entire country. And get this, possibly the largest regulatory body on earth. So the Congress has made the Fed more powerful on the one side, while at the same time saying, well, we've got to rein them in. We've got to get this audit. But every audit that they throw at the Fed is like a spitwad hitting the side of the Bismarck battleship. It just slides right off. It goes nowhere. And these audit bills end up taking a dirt nap, if you'll pardon the expression, but they die very quickly. And so we've got an out-of-control Fed where the Congress is giving the Fed more power on one hand and asking it why it abuses its power on the other. Just amazing.
Well, I mean, this is very similar in many ways to when is the last time the Fed was actually audited? Do you know that?
Well, technically, in terms of an in-depth audit, which would have to include its monetary policy, how it goes about bringing money into existence, under what conditions, under what terms, at what interest rates, at what interval, all this. In that respect, the answer is zero. There's a basic audit of its balance sheet that's been there for some time, but that doesn't mean a whole lot. That's kind of like money in, money out, and sundries, things like that. You might be able to glean a little bit from that data, but the Holy Grail is the monetary policy that thou shalt not look at, and that includes thou shalt not have Congress look at it. So all Congress has been able to do under the banking committees is pass the FORM Act, which requires the Fed to announce the basic criteria of its monetary policy. The Federal Reserve would still have total independence to formulate and implement the monetary policy, but supposedly under this bill, which has only been passed by the House, supposedly under this bill, Congress would be able to at least have some indication on the how and why and reasoning behind the monetary policy. But as I said, it's only passed the House. It probably won't get through the Senate during this presidential election year. That's very difficult to predict. And Obama has already threatened to veto the FORM Act. So once again, even this extremely modest Fed audit bill, the FORM Act that I'm talking about here, even that has a chance of taking a dirt nap and dying in the same mass grave that the other Federal Reserve audit bills are lying in right now. So this is an uphill battle for proponents that want to audit or end the Fed, and it's a big uphill battle for the harder-nosed members of Congress that want to get more scrutiny on the Fed.
In this country, the Bank of England is not subject to any kind of freedom of information legislation. I presume it's the same situation in the States.
It's extremely limited. There's a little bit, as I say, there's an audit of the balance sheets. There's this required semi-annual report to Congress that I reported on with that American Free Press story that you're showing there. They did grill her a little harder. She did give them a little bit of an answer, but a lot of times she has them dancing around legerdemain and confusing language and a bunch of verbal shenanigans. The Fed is a hard tiger to get a hold of by the tail, and Congress has to stop giving it power and then asking the Fed to relinquish power on the other hand. It's just lunacy.
Okay, well, let's move on to the next subject then, because a week or so, well, a few days ago, you sent me an article for publication on the UK Column website entitled Weaponizing Media Turns Up the Heat, Targets Dissident Thought. So the media certainly has been weaponized, and at least that's your viewpoint. And I thought it was an excellent opinion piece. Just give us a little background to this.
Well, I think there's some objectivity here. You're right, it is an opinion piece in terms of, I put a lot of A for attitude in this one. But I've been watching the media very closely, as you have, Mike, and the BBC and its clandestine operations, where the BBC purports to report the news, but it also has these cultural change agents that go into countries and do all sorts of surveys and do all sorts of intel, if you will, to see how these countries measure up in regards to fitting into the global grid that the westernized powers, the banking powers and military powers and whatnot, they want every country to adapt to that grid. And so I've been watching just like you have, and this particular issue of Time, Weaponized Media, one of these glossy coffee table magazines that Time Life puts out once in a while, as it states here with that photograph, I found it on a newsstand and got to thumbing through it. And the phenomenon I've seen in the media over the last 5 to 10 years is really turning up the heat, where anybody with a dissident viewpoint, particularly alternative media, as well as just citizens, anyone that has a viewpoint outside the mainstream media comfort zone, is being labeled a dissident in such a manner where they can be put on kind of a hit list, and that hit list wouldn't necessarily be hit in the literal sense, but it would definitely be more surveillance up to and including arrest, certainly demonization and criminalization of dissident thought is right around the corner. I've never seen it as close as it is now. They've got not just terms like anti-government, but they use terms, as I mentioned in the story, the culture of mistrust. They're getting online. They say that elites in business and government and whatnot are forging plans behind the scenes. How can they say such things? Don't they know that climate change is 100% true? Don't they know that 9/11 was simply Osama bin Laden? Can't this culture of mistrust, can't we get around this? Can't we all be as one? And I think you see where I'm going with this. They don't want problems solved. They want conventional history to stand. They want no dissident thought gaining too much steam with too much unity that might unseat or dislodge the dominant narrative across the board. 9/11, the Waco raid here in Texas, the Oklahoma City bombing, going back to JFK, and so on and so forth. Basically, Time Life was founded by Henry Luce, who was a skull and bonesman out of Yale. That's that elite fraternity that is a upward ladder for the power structure. And Henry Luce went on to work openly and unashamedly with intelligence figures such as Allen Dulles, who was later on the Warren Commission that purported to solve the Kennedy shooting. But Luce would work with intelligence figures in building his multimedia Time Life empire, going back to the days of JFK and before that. And now we've seen a steady line where the term conspiracy theory was coined during the post-JFK days, right around the mid-1960s, up till the present. And the idea is to use hurtful and pejorative language and to confuse the public discourse in such a way where people will pick up this magazine and say, oh, I don't want to be among the crowd that thinks this way. I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist because then I'm not part of the social register. I'm not part of acceptable society. So they're trying to drive a wedge between what's acceptable and what's not, and they're turning up the heat like never before. And as I say, that's to keep the dominant media narrative in place, because I think they fear, to some extent, the powers that be, not just the internet. The internet is a mixed bag, although it's very efficient and saves a lot of costs. But they're trying to stave off the influence of the alternative media. That would include American Free Press and UK columns somewhere. And they're trying to stave off the influence of people figuring out what's going on in too many categories. And as I say, that would threaten or dislodge or loosen the dominant narrative.
Well, just before we move on from this, I just want, just for the people that are listening to this on the podcast rather than watching it on video, the front page of this is entitled Modern Day Conspiracy Theories. Very interesting choice of imagery because they've put Edward Snowden on the left-hand side and Marilyn Monroe on the right-hand side.
Yes.
And you know, we have in one case Edward Snowden, who has provided not a conspiracy theory, but direct, hard documentary evidence of his claims of NSA spying, all absolutely accurate. On the other hand, we have an event which, a bit like JFK, remains unsolved to a certain degree. And they're trying to mix these two together and really bring Edward Snowden's revelations down to the level of a sordid, seedy discussion about who may or may not have murdered Marilyn Monroe.
Exactly.
And so what I was going to ask is that the similar vein through the pages of the magazine then?
Oh, absolutely, Mike. That's one of the chief techniques or tactics being used here by the Time Life East Coast establishment powers that be to lump in believable, plausible theories and facts, people like Edward Snowden that have a lot more credibility to them, and to lump them in with more puerile, um, gossipy, tabloidy stuff like Marilyn Monroe and the mystery surrounding her death, so as to subsume everything in to degrade the whole discussion to where everything can be lumped together as being just a sordid discussion of tabloid news that really has no credibility. They're trying to deplete the whole value of everything, and any tree that sticks up too high is cut off short to match the others. A leveling effect that will cheapen the whole discussion. So you're spot on, and that's what I also share in that article. I would encourage your listeners and viewers to read that.
Okay, well, look, let's move on. We showed this particular story from, it's an opinion piece on Medium on yesterday's news, and I'm just really using that as an introduction to something from the Brookings Institute that you wanted to comment on. But really, Donald Trump receiving a lot of sort of, people are considering that perhaps he's a little mad in many ways. But nonetheless, he seems to have gained a lot of traction in the Republican Party, and perhaps that's more a reflection of the state of the Republican Party than anything else. But Brookings here, this I believe is an audio podcast available. Why the right went wrong: conservatism from Goldwater to the Tea Party and beyond. The point of the earlier article was to suggest that when you look at particularly Trump, it's easy to understand how Hitler came to power in Germany, because people were so asleep that and in fact they welcomed him, and there's some parallels being drawn with Trump. But what is the Brookings take on this then?
Well, bear with me. I can try to help sort this out. Okay. Here in the States, you've got William Kristol, the head of the Weekly Standard, going on TV and saying that Trump is so much outside the comfort zone, just like Time Life says that dissident media, alternative media, and a lot of citizens on the internet are outside the comfort zone. Mr. Kristol's saying that Trump is so far outside the comfort zone that the neoconservative Republican wing, that huge block of Republicanism that he represents, would rather have Hillary Clinton in the White House, and he admitted that on national television. Now, what does that mean? Now, keep in mind that William Kristol is the father of Irving Kristol, and Irving Kristol is an intellectual heir of Theodore Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism. And so the Weekly Standard neoconservative construct, which includes the neoconservative faction in Republican politics, in conservatism, in the Weekly Standard or in related media, in think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute, in think tanks like the Brookings Institution, neoconservatism is being substituted for standard conservatism. Now, whatever one might think of Donald Trump doesn't fit the neoconservative, pro-Israeli mold. At least he doesn't fit it well enough. So they'd rather have Hillary in there than him. See, so because of the intellectual lineage back to Zionism, suddenly they can say that Trump is a Hitler. You get the connection?
Right.
They're kind of saying like, well, we pro-Israeli neocons, we're going to compare him to Hitler because that's the natural thing they do in always saying that Hitler was, this scourge of history, and that he is always the whipping boy for anything that upsets the Israeli apple cart. So because Trump doesn't fit the neocon pro-Israeli mold, they're using the Hitler thing as a broad brush to try and tar and feather him. And at the same time, when they talk about the Goldwater Tea Party thing being a bad thing in this Brookings program, it's kind of subtle, but here's how it comes out. In the 1960s, Barry Goldwater brought forth another kind of conservatism. Actually, I should say the traditional kind, and that was the paleoconservative movement. And the idea was that Republicans would not be pro-war, that they would be non-interventionist, and that we wouldn't just police the globe unabashedly and without restraint like we would now. Well, along come the Rockefeller Republicans, which, after the shooting of JFK, engineered it so Lyndon Johnson, kind of an interim president, was able to get in representing the Rockefeller Republicans and push the Goldwater paleoconservative movement out. And that made the Republican Party, even though Johnson was a Democrat, it was still an adequate substitute for a while until they could get Richard Nixon in, and then they could push this new brand of conservatism, which evolved into neoconservatism, and suddenly conservatism became pro-war and very, very, very Israeli first in its orientation. So I know this is a bit complex, but to make a long story short, Brookings is making a bad image of the Goldwaters and the Tea Party because that represents the old conservative wing that didn't believe in constant war and policing of the globe. They're trying to erase that from history. They don't like Trump because he doesn't fit their mold, so they call him Hitler or compare him with Hitler. And now they're having these programs saying, oh, you know, the Goldwater years, oh, some people might have liked that, but it was just a quaint phase that we were going through. It doesn't mean anything. And sure enough, William Kristol is involved in these discussions. And they've redefined conservatism to mean the neo-Trotskys of the neocon movement, which actually is somewhat left-wing in its orientation, and the whole lineage from Theodore Herzl to Irving Kristol to William Kristol, pushing real conservatism out of the way, substituting the fake kind, the pro-war kind, and that's the larger meaning of all this that doesn't come through at first glance, and it takes a little bit of study, but that over the years is what I and other researchers, such as the late Michael Collins Piper, of American Free Press, my former colleague who passed away, he put a lot of that together too.
Well, do you think that these people are going to move to the Democrat Party? Because as Salon points out here, even the critics of Hillary Clinton understate how catastrophically bad the NATO bombing of her led NATO bombing of Libya was, and then we have this. Actually, this is coming from an Israeli source. No global cop. The victims of Obama's appeasement is what they're describing it as. But what they're basically saying that as a result of Obama's direct action plus his overall foreign policy, that more people have been killed in war under Obama than under Bush. It's hardly surprising with these types of statistics that Kristol and the neocons would be supporting Clinton in this case.
Yeah, there's a lot of ironies going on. There's people in the progressive movement that don't want Hillary in. They want to vote for Bernie Sanders for the Democratic nomination for U.S. president precisely because of Hillary's history in Libya, 2011, when British and NATO and U.S. planes and French planes mercilessly and cruelly and callously bombed Libya like that. And so that makes a lot of the standard progressives depart from Hillary, while at the same time, the neocons, thinking that Trump isn't enough their way, isn't enough of one of them, they want to go for Hillary and support her where progressives want to abandon her and support Sanders. That's the strange thing going on here. A lot of shifting alliances because partially because Trump is such a gadfly, whatever one may think of him. But the other part, you were saying, Mike, before we went on, that under Obama's belt, or excuse me, on his watch, they're actually thinking that there are more killed in action victims of war than under Bush. Was that it?
That's what this Israeli article is talking about. More people killed in war than under Bush, who conducted 2 long wars overseas. So you know this is they're not just talking about people that have been killed directly by the use of bombs dropped by American forces and drones and so on, but they're also talking about how Obama has implemented his foreign policy abroad and the conflicts that has caused. So it's a broader look at the effect of this current president as compared to Bush, but nonetheless, it is a point that they're making that Obama's record here is not so good.
That's very interesting. I think what it is, partially from an American perspective, is that what Obama's done has been so piecemeal, a little bit at a time, death by 1,000 cuts rather than a couple big gouges like W. W was right there when we first went into Iraq in March of 2003, and this very month. Matter of fact, 4 days ago in 2003 was when the U.S. first attacked Iraq with the shock and awe bombing. And so, yeah, Bush had the more dramatic go in and get them, however misguided.
Whereas Obama, we're talking about perpetual war effectively here.
Yeah, lots of little clandestine drone attacks, attacking, family reunions, funerals, wherever a purported terrorist was located. It didn't seem to matter what the collateral damage was, excuse me. And so that's part of it. Is Obama's lots of little missions where Bush was the main part of the war on terror, with the main, so-called authorized war and whatnot. But one thing I'll add, just as an accent, is several years ago I found that according to the Gulf War Veterans Information Systems, that's a database online, that U.S. casualties in the war on terror, which are often peddled around by the mainstream media as, 6,000 or 7,000 in Iraq killed in action, and maybe 5,000 or 6,000 in Afghanistan, and a few here and there. And they make it look like maybe we've lost, maybe 15,000 KIAs. But if you count the people that die later from disease and non-battle injury, that's DNBI. Historically, more soldiers have died of disease and non-battle injury than have died in direct military battlefield conflict, being killed in action right there on the spot.
And increasingly, tragically, suicide as well.
Yes, and so if you add the suicides, the DNBI, disease, non-battle injury, different exposure to chemicals, exposure to toxins, you add it all up, the U.S., according to the data I've seen, has lost in the Afghanistan and Iraqi theaters conservatively. I'm going to be as conservative as I can here and say we've lost more like 75,000.
Wow.
Not 12 to 15,000. And that is as conservative as putting a size 31 belt on a sumo wrestler.
Right.
And so the killed in action is a small slice of the overall deaths due to war.
So there you go, military deaths, Brian.
Well, yes, huge impact, and of course a subject that's not being properly discussed at the moment. We've got this article from the Mirror, which we'll just bring on screen. Armed Forces suicide every 2 weeks, the shocking mental toll affecting our young men and women. So we've got the unlawful wars created by the government, we've got the deaths, and we've got the injuries during the fighting, and then we've got suffering which goes on afterwards. But that's all being swept under the carpet at the moment. And as this article says, that basically there's no proper support for ex-servicemen and women after their service. And it's been remarkable that UK Column has been contacted over the years by a steady stream of ex-military people talking about the care they did or did not receive at the hands of the government. And we've also heard some remarkable stories of people who said to us that they were encouraged to commit suicide as a result of seeing psychiatrists acting for the Ministry of Defence. That wasn't from the same area of the country, that was people reporting their experiences from different areas of the country. And I'll just add, we also know that some of the mainstream newspapers are currently investigating what seems to be an epidemic of mental health problems amongst ex-servicemen and women that was not apparent before in other conflicts. So we wonder whether something strange is going on under the surface. Well, that probably leads us nicely into what's happening with the EU referendum.
I just thought it would be nice to mention a blog posting from somebody who's under the age of 50 and discussing these issues. This is Aaron Taylor talking about TTIP. Really, he says the Trade and Investment Partnership, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, a bilateral trade deal being negotiated between the European Union and the United States of America, a deal branded by the EU as a deal to boost economies and make trade between the US easier. It goes on to say, to put it briefly, TTIP is an attack on our NHS, food and environmental safety, banking regulation, privacy, jobs, and even our already diminishing democracy. There are many strong cases that TTIP will open up our public services, including our NHS, to big American investors who will be able to bid on NHS contracts and so on. And he points out that David Cameron is a persistent supporter of TTIP, and he's saying we are left with one simple and highly positive option in order to avoid TTIP, and that is voting to leave the European Union on June the 23rd, 2016. And I think the main point I wanted to make here, Brian, and you can comment on this, is, of course, just leaving, just voting for Brexit is not enough. First of all, as I pointed out before, if you vote yes to remain within the European Union, you are, in fact, giving your consent to TTIP, because that is part and parcel, a very key part of the of Cameron's document, which defines the renegotiation. But the key point here, Brian, as you were discussing on the Crane Report last night, is that a vote to come out doesn't mean that the agenda stops. Now, in Cameron's document, he has made it clear that TTIP is absolutely front and central of the government's and his policy agenda. So a vote to leave the EU is not a vote to leave TTIP, because, of course, we would then begin a new trade negotiation and we'd find ourselves right back where we started, right back at this point of being imminently in this trade deal.
Very important point, Mike. With Ian Crane, what we said is that basically the whole of the EU agenda is in the grain of the country. It's not simply policy is coming in and being filtered through Parliament. This policy is now absolutely embedded in the civil service and the public sector. And what we see is that, let's say there's a vote, the vote's to come out, and the EU agenda simply continues to be rolled out through the civil service. We're going to talk about education in a minute, and we can really give an example of how this policy making is embedded to very, very low level. So if there's a vote to come out of the EU, what has to accompany it is a complete exposure of these European Union policy networks. And I think they should be outlawed. Any organisation that deals with the EU should be forced to disclose it. Failure to do so would be a criminal offence. And I've no doubt that other people will be pointing out, of course, that you can track a lot of policy through the EU back to the United Nations. So if we look at a world government, world trade policy, invariably we're coming back to the UN, and we'll mention them in a minute. But a lot of work to be done if this country is to rid itself of what I think has become a cancer, and that is the European Union.
Right. Many people question whether campaigning has any effect, and whether getting involved in campaigns has any effect. And on the face of it, it doesn't seem to, because the agenda seems to press on regardless. On the other hand, and we've got to thank Guy Taylor for this, when you see this type of situation arising, you've got to appreciate the effect that people's campaigns are having on the establishment in this country. So this is the Law Commission, who have started a consultation on misconduct in public office. Now, just to remind everybody, the focus of the British Constitution Group conference in January or February, whenever it was, 2015, was misconduct in public office, and we were suggesting that the use of grand juries, the reuse of grand juries, which are still lawful in this country, could be used, in fact, as a mechanism for launching private prosecutions for misconduct in public office. Now, people are starting to run with this, so it's nice to see this type of panic clearly appearing from the establishment. So what are they saying? They're saying it is a consultation, and they've published their first paper on misconduct in public office. It's called Issues Paper 1. The current law is a background document that sets out, it's a background document which sets out the current law of misconduct in public office, highlighting problems that arise through areas of uncertainty as well as gaps and overlaps with alternative offences. And of course, they are particularly panicking about the fact that this is a common law offence. So what they say is misconduct in public office is a common law offence. It is not defined by any statute. Just for clarity, that's good. It carries a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. The offence requires that a public officer acting as such willfully neglects to perform his duty and or willfully misconducts himself to such a degree as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust in the office holder without reasonable excuse or justification. And then they go on to identify a number of problems with the offence through lack of definition. But of course, common law offences are defined by case law. So in fact, all these issues are defined quite clearly through case law. Really what they are aiming for is to look at whether misconduct in public office should be removed.
Because they are very worried, Mike, as you say. It's pretty obvious. We saw the attempt to remove treason laws previously. Now we've gone down a level. Now we're going to try and get rid of misconduct in public office. Why do we need that? Well, you need it. Let's think about the child abuse situation, where at the moment councils are attempting to buy off victims with really disgraceful compensation amounts, £10,000 for a life of abuse. But of course, nobody points a finger at the individuals in the particular councils. So this is why we need it. That's why they're trying to get rid of it. Now, just to end very quickly on the subject of the way that the EU has embedded itself into British society, let's just have a look at education. And we're going to thank David Scott for identifying this. So there's a series of organisations and documents. They came to light through this, Beyond the Comfort Zone. And this has been produced by a group called Global Ethics. This is one of the comments of an attendee at this conference. It was a delight to be around so many individuals, all committed to moving the work on education for citizenship forward within our own contexts. And we've got this one here. Given that each of us is going to have to take on responsibility, like it or not, for making moral judgments, even if to choose a faith and its authority as a basis for those, wouldn't it be a good idea to make sure they have the intellectual and emotional maturity to discharge it adequately? That kind of maturity is developed by a liberal approach to moral and religious education based on reason and debate, not an authoritarian one. And see what it says. That's Stephen Law, The War for Children's Minds. So we're just going to ask this question, what is really being discussed here? But if we go and have a look into this organisation, here are the backers. So we've got Gordon Cook, but we've also got the Department of Education, and we can see Global Ethics there. So just highlight Global Ethics down at the bottom. These are some of the people that attended the conference. So we've got people from the government, we've got people from the education sector, we've got a lot of consultants and advisors, but we've also got the head of the pupil engagement team, Welsh Assembly Government. So it's a mixture of Quangos, advisors, consultants, and the government. Well, here is the Institute for Global Ethics, and should we trust them? Well, if you go and have a look at the board of directors, we've got some interesting people. We've got Bluefin Trading, a proprietary trading firm. So this is the first gentleman, Timothy
Brown.
Thank you, Timothy Brown. And if we follow it on through, we've got very large accountancy firms. This is all corporatist agenda. So the people who are setting the policy for children have just come straight out of the boardroom of very powerful global corporations. Let's have a look at this one, because they're linked in, the Five Nations Network. And we just highlight down here because we've got the Council of Europe Charter on Education for Democratic Citizenship and Human Rights. So don't worry, we've got the EU now firmly embedded into the system. Here's the Council of Europe. This is what they say about themselves, an international contact group. on citizenship and human rights, and they're very big on education, and they also say here that they're going to work to mould the attitude and behaviour of children. So the European Union buried at the heart of this pernicious network, and they are fully advertising that what they're after are the minds of children. So here's one of the cooperation documents, letter of cooperation in view of establishing the International Contact Group on Citizenship and Human Rights. And of course, this is the heart of the beast, because here is the UN input, which is very important. So if we put this together very quickly so that we can just see a picture of it, here is another organisation, the Association for Citizenship Teaching. We need an upstanding person behind that. So Lord Blunkett is one of the key drivers, Mike.
Couldn't think of a better man.
Couldn't think of a better man. Here's the European input, Council of Europe. We've got some very strange foundations. This is the Gordon Cook Foundation, and they also link into the Association of Directors of Education in Scotland. And we've also got another trust over here, the MacRobert Trust. Not really sure what they do at all, but I'm sure they've got the best interests children. Here's the Institute for Global Ethics, back to the network document, and then here's the admission that this is basically about the war for children's minds. So we better add in the UN on the far right of your screen, and this is a pretty dangerous network. Let's say we voted to come out of the European Union tomorrow, we've still actually got the European Union embedded in schools and teaching children what the EU thinks they should be taught, not what their parents think. Unbelievably dangerous. If anybody cares to do some research on this subject which we've just covered, we'd be very grateful for, because the network is so extensive and so deep, it requires a full team. But if you've got concerns about who's getting into schools to get into the mind of your child or your children, then we could do with some help exposing that.
Alex Thompson joins us tomorrow.
Indeed, from Eastern Approaches, so we'll be having a look at what's really happening in Europe, and I think we're about to join Ian Crane, is that correct?
Yes, so we're going to show last night's Crane Report and Fracking Nightmare immediately after this programme.
Okay, that's it for today's news. We'll be back at 1 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye.